David Brian Mueller here on Tuesday, March the 6th, 2012, working on a draft article entitled Tunnel Tribulations Overview. These little boys and girls have been playing cowboys versus the Indian, or Nazis versus the Jewish boy with me. I suspect that they are law enforcement operatives, and they're still on their mission to discredit and destroy me, and to deprive me of any benefit from psychoactive drugs, which I have been conditioned to consume, and have benefited from since I was a youth. These law enforcement operatives are zealots and do not even tolerate prescribed and or legal drugs. They have, quote, hazed me countless times. Most recently, I suspect that they constructed a secret tunnel under my house and used classified mind control technology to terrorize me. They use aversive conditioning, simulated telepathy, and hypnotic techniques. I even wonder if they may have adulterated my prescribed medications at times, as indeed they have access to American pharmacies for law enforcement purposes. They utilize extraordinary means of surveillance and engage in organized gang stalking. I wonder if they keep my relatives under a gag order so they do not divulge to me what is really going on and who is responsible for the crimes being committed against me. They seem to have caused my relatives to engage in harmful behaviors towards me, and this makes it more difficult to recover from the years I have spent as a recipient of Social Security disability insurance, which I received because of the traumatic stress I have endured over many years. They interfere with my computer and internet activities, and I suspect that they keylog and monitor everything I do, which causes me great distress as I am trying to compose original music, literature, art, and so on, and I fear that they might try to alter or steal my creations as I produce them. In other words, they might sabotage my works, and thus they might be engaging in a form of industrial sabotage and espionage. But how can I hold them accountable if they are police? They already have sabotaged my first 49 years as a human being, and inevitably sabotage my every effort to enjoy life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. They've caused me to have very restricted and fixed social opportunities, and I am very handicapped finding new associates, especially ones that are not already tainted by their influence. I believe that their conduct is malicious and criminal, and that they affect not only me but millions of Americans, that they are a threat to human rights and to our national security, as they are diametrically opposed to the values and principles upon which our nation was founded. Again, over the years, they have hazed me many times. They especially do this when they know that I am under the influence of various psychoactive substances. I have always believed that drugs, I mean the kinds that are typically restricted as controlled substances, such as cannabinoids, opioids, stimulants, and psychedelics, are not at all as harmful as is advertised, and instead have many benefits, and that it should be legal for American citizens to discover and enjoy those benefits and use them constructively if they so choose, whereas they are committed to the opposite belief and seem willing to injure or obstruct anybody who makes it appear that drugs are not a great evil that must be controlled by the criminal justice system. They try to induce stress and panic and then try to make it appear that substance use is responsible for the resulting stressed out and panicked behavior. Or they try to tempt subjects to behave in ways that might scandalize or incriminate them or make them appear mentally ill, and then blame everything on the drug use rather than on the deliberate and malicious efforts by these law enforcement operatives and their allies to negatively affect a subject's perceptions and behavior so as to confirm anti-drug sentiments and prejudices. For example, during my most recent hazing experience, they caused annoying light shows with some kind of high-frequency device so as to induce stress and panic. They also made various noises beneath my home, causing me to fear an imminent home invasion. I suspect that they used classified technology to cause me to hear particular voices as if they were coming out of the heating ducts and tried to frighten me. They employed hypnotic techniques and almost had me believing that a crisis had occurred, when in fact it had not. I believe they also hypnotized my mother on this and other occasions, and I believe they caused her to suffer various symptoms when they were doing these things to me. I have a special gift for remaining partly aware when in a hypnotic trance, and I will recall what happened during the trance and was troubled by my mother's seeming inability to do the same. Finally, I called the FBI office in Springfield to complain of my situation recently and express my fear that I was about to be harmed. I had called that office many times before to complain that my civil rights were being violated by local law enforcement operatives. After that call, the threat subsided, and by the next morning, the sounds beneath my house ceased. In addition to my ability to recall trance states, I have a few other things working in my favor. First, I am clairvoyant, and that has helped me survive all these years, but being clairvoyant does not make one perfect, and adversaries can still at least temporarily deceive and mislead even a clairvoyant individual. If this sounds crazy, I mean my assertion that I am clairvoyant. Keep in mind that many respected law enforcement agencies have hired and utilized so-called psychic detectives, some of whom are likewise recognized to be clairvoyant. I also am always accompanied by friendly voices. These are particular voices associated with me for about 20 years now. My voices are very dear to me and are my most intimate confidants. We communicate by means of what seems to be a form of telepathy coupled with clairvoyance. I have no way to verify who or what these voices are that have attached themselves to me, so I don't even try to verify any of that anymore. I just know that they have helped me cope with many stressful situations and have provided reliable advice and feedback when I really needed such input. I also have no choice in the matter as they communicate with me constantly, whether I wish them to or not, but I don't really mind that as I find them very beneficial nonetheless. I also try to think positively and imagine, perhaps foolishly or wishfully, that I am the teacher's pet of some old-school CIA factions and other friendly factions from within the government, who I imagine recruited me when I was a child as a human research subject into research into human potential, including the development of paranormal abilities. My father worked for the federal government. I remember as a small child visiting his office and being allowed into a computer room. This was in the 1960s, meeting men and women who worked there. Memories of this caused me to entertain possible ways to explain my strange circumstances that at least might be remotely plausible. I imagine that within this Veterans Administration office, there's really a secret CIA facility hidden in St. Louis in that building on Market Street. I imagine that they recruited many children this way in the 1950s and 1960s to be research subjects like myself, and I like to imagine that they never intended to harm any of them in any really bad way. The research includes psychedelic and other drugs, and perhaps the researchers presumed that attitudes towards these drugs would soften, and that someday such drugs would be consumed by millions so as to enrich our nation's pool of talent and genius, and to enhance our nation's health and quality of life. Instead, events, in fact, increasingly moved in the opposite direction, towards coercive authoritarian policies based on disinformation and ignorance, and in ways that threaten the alleged surviving research participants, I imagine. I like to imagine these factions still have influence to protect research subjects from any real and lasting harm from uninformed adversaries in law enforcement. This particular imagining seems to have been verified by the 37 years of experimentation that I engage in with little or no effective overt opposition to my activities by law enforcement operatives, except that ironically, I ran into all kinds of problems when I started utilizing legally purchased dextromethorphan products in 2006. Law enforcement also became all involved in my life recently when, despite medical privacy legislation to the contrary, they became all involved with trying to deprive me of prescribed stimulant medication that I found very beneficial, and instead used coercion so that harmful psychotropics were administered to me without my full and voluntary consent. Since the 1980s, I had felt constantly threatened by what I perceived to be covert actions directed against me by law enforcement operatives. What seems to actually have happened is that many of the surviving participants now became unwitting subjects in unethical and harmful law enforcement-sponsored research that revolved around fear-based behavior modification and punishment. It was probably never anticipated in the 1960s that the United States of America would become so harsh and so coercive so that in the year 2012, law enforcement operatives would have the power to totally discredit and destroy anybody who had anything positive to report about drugs. But that is what occurred. Who could have imagined that law enforcement operatives would someday be allowed to commit heinous crimes against American citizens to make their version of reality appear to be the correct one? Who could have imagined that many of these alleged research subjects would be misdiagnosed as mentally ill, and that mental illness in the year 2012 would still be a stigmatizing label? In the mind of public opinion, many Americans believe that a mentally ill individual is likely a dangerous and unpredictable violent criminal, rather than a person to whom a medical diagnosis has been applied, a diagnosis reserved for those with injured psyches and broken hearts, who more than anybody need social acceptance and support and not stigmatization. I imagine surviving wise old researchers would affirm, especially now after so many years of experience, that the law enforcement approach to the issue of drugs and other alleged social ills could only have been devised by our nation's worst enemies, and would also know of rampant misdiagnoses of individuals as mentally ill or delusional, when really they were gifted individuals experiencing misunderstood phenomena as human research subjects, and were hated because they confounded the false version of reality hawked by law enforcement operatives and their allies. Perhaps it was originally intended that alleged research subjects would be debriefed at some point in their adult lives, but then coercive authoritarians infiltrated government to such an extent that intended promises could not be kept until these adversaries of the alleged research subjects are checked by the cycle of checks and balances that are supposed to be at work in our system. Now many pockets of individuals are stranded in a situation where, under the domination of law enforcement interests, it's as if our worst enemies had conquered our nation's once brave and free people, and positive research into human potential has been perverted into experiments in fear, degradation, control, and abuse of some of the most gifted individuals in our society. And these gifted individuals in our society are totally adrift because of this. The original research logically would have selected children with significant latent potential, and as it is, society has been robbed of much of the manifestation of that potential had things gone differently. Hopefully the tides will soon turn and truth, justice, and the American way will prevail over fear and repression and distortion and denial of truth. I wish that those who commit crimes against me, when they endlessly haze me and commit espionage and sabotage against me, would be held accountable, and that the public would be made aware of the kinds of things they are doing that harm precious American citizens such as myself, and in so doing harm society as a whole. I could finally pursue the virtuous and meaningful life that I always intended to live and deserved to live, and society might receive much more back from me than it has up until now.